Peace and love. Welcome to another edition of Truth of the Mind. This is your host, Vinny L, bringing you more of the topics you are looking for. Today we're going to speak on some inconsistencies and hypocrisies that we know about in modern society. Specifically, I'm speaking about the fiction of white supremacy. Now, many people may question the topic. The fiction of white supremacy. Isn't white supremacy an established fact? That's what we're going to talk about today, and that's what we're going to discuss. Whether white supremacy is a fact of society, whether it is ingrained in society, whether white supremacy has permeated the crevices of all facets and become a prerequisite in American Western society. Before I start, I just want to give some basic overviews of the terms we're using. You know me, I'm a big advocate of etymology. Etymology, for those who do not know, is the science, the study of the origins of words. You should definitely seek to find the etymology of all the terms you use so you know exactly what you are saying and what your meaning will be because of the changes in meanings throughout history. What you say today may not mean necessarily what you think it does. For example, the word nice. As many know, the word nice is used in many different ways to describe people who are kind, sweet, good-natured folk. But nice has an etymology that is quite different. It comes from Middle English, in the sense stupid, from Old French, from Latin, ignorant, to not know. People need to understand that just because you use a certain word and in today's society it's used in a certain way does not necessarily mean what it means. Now, taking the topic at hand, the fiction of white supremacy, this brings up the term white and also its opposite, black. Now, I'm big on the books, y'all. In my hands I have the Etymologicon by Mark Forsyth, an excellent book for people who are into words and are into the definitions of words and why words are what they are today. He has a section speaking on black. Right, this is page 28 of the Etymologicon by Mark Forsyth. Etymologists have a terrible time distinguishing black from white. You'd think that the two concepts could be kept apart, but that wasn't how the medieval English thought about things. They were a confusing bunch of people and must have had a terrible time ordering coffee. The Oxford English Dictionary itself feebly admits that, quote, in Middle English, it is often doubtful whether black, B-L-A-C, black, B-L-A-K, Blake, B-L-A-C-K-E, means black, dark, or pale, colorless, wan, livid. Chess would have been a confusing game, but on the plus side, racism must have been impractical. Utterly illogical, though all this may sound, there are two good explanations. Unfortunately, nobody is quite sure which one is true. I shall give you both. Once upon a time, there was an old Germanic word for burnt, which was black, B-L-A-C-K, or as close to black as makes no difference. The confusion arose because the old Germanics couldn't decide between black and white as to which color burning was. Some old Germans said that when things were burning, they were bright and shiny. And other old Germans said that when things were burnt, they turned black. The result was a hopeless monochrome confusion until everybody got bored and rode off to sack Rome. The English were left holding black, which could mean either pale or dark, but slowly settled on one usage. The French also imported this useless black word. They put an N in it and later sold it on to the English as blank, leaving us with black and blank. The other theory is that there was an old German word black, which meant bare, vivid, and empty. What do you have if you don't have any colors? Well, it's hard to say, really. If you close your eyes, you see nothing, which is black. But a blank piece of paper is usually white. Under this theory, blankness is the original sense, and the two colors, black and white, are simply different interpretations of what blank means. Now, as you see, Mr. Forsyth in his Etymologicon, he clearly displays the inconsistencies in the etymologies of the term white and black. All right, in order for us to properly identify what white supremacy is, first we need to understand what white is, and what black is, and what white isn't, and what black isn't. All right. Now, I've said this before, and I'll say it again. People aren't colors. Anyone who identifies by a color is grammatically incorrect. I'll just say that. Why do I say that? Well, let's look at the definitions of our parts of speech. A noun is a person, place, or thing. Only nouns can describe people. Colors are clearly adjectives. Adjectives describe nouns. So either you're a noun, a person, place, or thing, or you are an adjective, which is a descriptive word. Descriptive words can't identify anyone. All right? That's the first part of the inconsistencies and the fiction behind the term white supremacy. Now, moving on to the term supremacy. People need to understand, again, these terms have meanings. It would be very wise for you to not only look up these meanings etymologically, but also to have a law dictionary and to see how these words are legally defined. Now, supremacy most definitely has a lawful legal definition. Supremacy: sovereign dominion, authority, and preeminence. The highest state. In the United States, the supremacy resides in the people and is exercised by their constitutional representatives, the President and Congress. C. Sovereignty. Interesting. So supremacy has something to do with your sovereignty, sovereign dominion, the highest state of being. All right. Now, we also have our plain dictionary. I got a Noah Webster's 1828 dictionary here. Supremacy: the state of being supreme or in the highest station of power, the highest authority or power. All right. Now, for us to truly see how white supremacy is a fiction, we have to understand the history in terms of government, nobility, sovereignty, and national origin. Now, in this respect, let's first look at what today is considered a white person. Now, white people, I'm using Wikipedia as a general source here, a universal source that anybody can access. White people is a racial classification specifier used mostly and often exclusively for people of European descent. The term had at times been expanded to encompass persons of Middle Eastern and North African descent. The usage of white people or a white race for a large group of mainly or exclusively European populations defined by their light skin, among other physical characteristics. We know these characteristics: blue eyes, blonde hair, etc., etc. These people contrast with so-called black people, Amerindians, and other people of color. Okay? Now, first things first, the term white race, white people, originated in the 17th century. It is not an old identifier. All right, we've talked about this in past episodes, where you had people like Blumenbach, Linnaeus. These were taxonomists, scientists in the 17th century, who began to classify organisms, living organisms, based on their physical characteristics. During their research, they ultimately had to come to a point where they had to classify the human race. This turned into the white, black, brown, yellow, red classifications you see commonly used in terminologies and informal settings. Usually people talking amongst themselves will use these terms to identify. And ultimately, we have created a society where these color code systems have permeated throughout all sense, all facets, just about everything we do. Culture, music, food, relationships, politics. They all have something to do with this color code system created by Linnaeus, Blumenbach, and their ilk. Now, white people have not, I repeat, have not been the dominant force on the planet for a very long time. They have not. In fact, it wasn't until about 1492 when Columbus sailed the ocean blue, so-called discovered the Americas, and established military operations in the New World. This was the beginning of a European push for global domination. Now, even though these Europeans had this push for global domination, these Europeans were not wholly light-skinned people. As we know, the people of Portugal, the people of Spain, who were the first to bring in this European global push for power, were basically miscegenated with North African Islamic Muslims who had, for over the last 700 years, dominated the Mediterranean. So let's put this into perspective, okay? For all intents and purposes, white supremacy, the fiction of white supremacy, if it is a truth in fact, has only lasted from 1492 to today, not counting the years of culminating and conquest that had to take place before the power was intact. Before that time, 700 years of North African Muslim dominance in the Mediterranean was what the Europeans were used to. And when I say Europeans, understand that the original European, known as the Grimaldi man, okay? The original European had more in common with so-called African, so-called Asiatic population. This Grimaldi man had the wide nose, wide lips, dark eyes, dark hair, pigmented skin. This is documented. The Grimaldi man. You also have the Cheddar man. You know, many people have attempted to debunk the Cheddar man, but it still holds many weight in archaeological circles, where the Cheddar man is considered a blue-eyed black man, so-called dark-skinned man. If this is the case, that would mean the original European was not light-skinned, and that the Europeans that populate that land today are not the original inhabitants of that land. All right. Now, if that's the case, that would kind of change up our interpretation of history and how they are the supreme, and how white supremacy is all-encompassing, as many seem to view it. White supremacy is a 20th century ideology created by separatists, anti-Masons, anti-Jews, anti-Catholics, who have incorporated many of the early revolutionary ideologies and mixed it with a paranoia that goes along with some of the essential components of the Caucasian races' genetic history. I'm speaking specifically about the time spent trapped within the caves and hills of Europe and Western Asia. Now, there's a book out called The Iceman's Inheritance. Okay? Iceman Inheritance by a brother named Michael Bradley. The Iceman Inheritance, Prehistoric Sources of Western Man's Racism, Sexism, and Aggression. In this book, Michael Bradley details how the daily intricacies of life within the cave and the caveman experience helped to shape some of the social and political actions and mind states used and enforced by so-called white people. Michael Bradley is a so-called white man and really shows convincing evidence to his arguments, specifically about so-called inferiority complexes and the need for aggression in order to assert dominance. Now, as we know, history will teach us that violence was a universal fact. All people were violent. However, there are cases of intense and unorthodox cruelty, cannibalism, behavior that would be seen as devilish in many ways. Right? Now, again, these are universal facts that all people have been faced with, but speaking of the last 1,000 years of history, it has been typically the European who has taken a step above other so-called races of the world in terms of aggression, sexism, slavery, genocide, mutilation, castration, sterilization, eugenics, etc., etc., etc. Now, seeing that we understand the history of how Europeans got to where they're at today, all right, Europeans invented the term white as an identifier. Before the colonization of the Americas, before the creation of the corporations, colonies of the United States, there were no white people, essentially. Another book, written by Theodore Allen, speaks on the invention of the white race and how entities use political and social terminology in order to invent a people. Understand that during the times of Roman dominance, during the age of the Egyptian Kemetic dominance, the age of the Israelites, biblical times, there was no white race. White was simply identified as meaning pure, untainted, light, positivity, etc., etc. We have to stop incorporating these new definitions with these terms and giving them credence by giving them a history that doesn't necessarily belong to them. When people start using terms like white supremacy, they're implying that the historical dominance of the so-called white race has been one of everlasting superiority. But we know in many physical aspects, and even in some mental aspects, how so-called white people have not been the most superior. In government, remember, the U.S. Constitution is not an invention of the European or so-called white race. It was essentially plagiarized from the Iroquois Confederation. Many things that we attribute to the superiority, to the greatness of so-called white people is in fact not necessarily so. Okay? Many people point to Europeans' advancements in technology. We know for a fact that the European could have never crossed the Atlantic Ocean without the instruments and intricate items and objects, scientific instruments used by the Arabs of North Africa, of Egypt, of Asia. All right? The European didn't know how to use a compass. Societies in Persia and China, in Southern Asia, in Africa, they all had access to this type of technology. Many people already know how the Moors of North Africa brought civilization to the Europeans. Remember 711 AD, the Islamic Moors moved into Spain, stopped only by Charles the Hammer in the Pyrenees Mountains of France. But if it wasn't for Charles Martel, Charles the Hammer, stopping that conquest, all of Europe would likely be under the Moorish influence, Islamic influence. The Europeans didn't know how to bathe. In fact, many of their saints were exalted because of the fact that they did not bathe. Understand that this fiction of white supremacy comes from a total ignorance of political history. You have to know the history for you to understand why these terms are incorrect and should never be used. If you continue to use the term white supremacy to describe people who push separatist movements to promote the so-called white race, you are essentially demeaning your own people by placing a people, giving them an exalted position that is not necessarily the case. Now, I am not an advocate also of using other terms such as black supremacy, yellow supremacy, brown supremacy, whatever. We have to understand that all of these ideological movements that are said to be white supremacists are not in fact white supremacists, but in fact separatist movements. Now, what is a separatist movement? And what makes it different than a white supremacist movement? Again, going back to these origins of words, we need to understand what these words mean in order to analyze, in order to come up with something that makes sense. Not only for us, but it's for the next generation, because people who constantly use the term white supremacy don't understand the psychological impact that has on children. When you are faced with the fact that a certain race is supreme over you, and that has always been the case, the emotional, mental, psychological effects can be disastrous. We need to understand our place in history as so-called black people, as yellow people, as so-called white people, as red people, as brown people, whoever we are. And we need to destroy these fictional terminologies used to identify the world around us. Now, what does separate mean? What are separatists? To separate means to disunite, to divide, to part in almost any manner, either things naturally or casually joined. Understand that so-called white people seeking separation isn't an attempt to destroy other populations. Now, history shows us that in many respects, the European have chosen genocide over necessarily conquest. Genocide and chattel slavery over conquest. In many respects, history will show you that the European doesn't want to take over all the lands of the earth. However, they would like its eternal use and the profits from that land to be sent directly to them. Now, this is different than what we necessarily would think. Many people would think that, Europeans, they just want global dominance, they want global power. They want to control all things. They don't necessarily want all things. And they still want to keep things separate. Now, if people of color took that same type of attitude and sought to build themselves up, only spread out when looking back, sending things back home. For example, African nations. African nations have a habit of sending things to other nations and receiving nothing in return. All right? Many African countries still pay France to this day upwards of billions of dollars yearly simply for existing. All right? There are agreements in place with African nations and the French where France unilaterally controls the land, the resources, and the economic systems. Now, is that white supremacy if there's an agreement involved? Understand that everything that so-called people of color, all of these chains, all of this bondage that we are under, mainly comes from the mind. In legal and lawful terms, many of the things that we complain about, we have already signed off on. Licenses, permits, certifications. All right? When we apply and we use these applications, which have to be signed under penalty of perjury, they have to be truthful, which makes it an affidavit, which makes it the sworn truth of facts, signed by you. People need to understand how they're using the pen. They are putting themselves under a white supremacist paradigm. People have written themselves into a system of white supremacy which doesn't even exist. Family, we need to understand how white supremacy is not a thing. The so-called white race has never been supreme. They have always been just like the rest of us. They have their issues just like we have ours. Now, what we need to understand is how can we flip the narrative? How can we establish not that blacks are the supreme, or that so-called Latinos or Asians or whatever person of color you are, that you are supreme. You need to find out what makes you supreme. You need to follow the culture, the ideology, the science that makes you the most supreme being that you can be. I am actually a very staunch advocate for white separatists, just like Brother Marcus Garvey was. Marcus Garvey understood that people who actually articulate their opinions and their views without trying to protect another's feelings is the most prudent way of solving modern issues, problems. How else can you come to an agreement without having the facts on the table? If people aren't being honest about their true feelings about one another, then how can anything truly get done? The KKK has always been upfront about how they feel about so-called people of color, Jews, Catholics, etc. Honestly, those types are much easier to do business with than ones who will tell you one thing while doing another. Hopefully, this will give you some clarity on where your current politicians lie in terms of supporting white supremacy or being against white supremacy, and if that necessarily means what you think it means. I hope this gives you a chance to reanalyze what a white supremacist is. The Clayton Bigsby's remember the Dave Chappelle show? You had Clayton Bigsby who played the blind KKK member. He's a perfect example of the inconsistencies and hypocrisies of the argument regarding white supremacy. Now again, y'all, we've hit the 30-minute mark. I think I've said enough on this matter for now. This was a very pleasant experience. I truly loathe people who use colors in order to identify others, and the term white supremacy is probably the most unintelligent, ignorant terms I've heard used in a long time. Well, I've heard it all my life, but it's taken me a while to be able to articulate why it necessarily doesn't need to exist and why it needs to be put in its proper perspective. But again, this is Truth of the Mind. It was a pleasure. This is Vinny L signing off. You guys can check me out. You got soundcloud.com/VinnyTheMore. I'm on Facebook, Vinny L Fernandez. I'm also on Instagram, VKid_VKID_. Hit me up. Send me topic ideas. If you have something you want to discuss, feel free. Send me a DM. Send me a message. Let's try to get your voice heard. Peace and love, family. Peace and love.